Hello, welcome to Prajim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 27 of SQL Server. In this session, we'll learn about the final set of datetime functions that are available in SQL Server. Specifically, we'll be looking at DatePart, DateAdd, and DateDiff functions. And finally, we'll look at a practical example of using these functions. Before continuing with this session, I strongly recommend to watch parts 25 and 26 of this video series. So, before we talk about anything, if you look at these three functions, DatePart, DateAdd, and DateDiff, all of them, have one common parameter, which is nothing but the date part. Okay. Now, what are the values that you can pass for this DatePart parameter? Those values are listed here. This is the complete name, and these are the abbreviations. We have spoken about this DatePart and their abbreviations in the previous session as well. Okay. Now let's look at DatePart. Before actually looking at this definition, let's look at the example and understand what this DatePart method trying to do. Now, if you look at the name itself, it's saying DatePart. You want the part of a date. Now, if you look at the date, it has got several parts. For example, it has got year, day, month, hours, minutes, seconds, etc. Now, it's possible that you can retrieve parts of that date using DatePart function. From this date, the second parameter that we have, from this date, I want a weekday part. Is it possible? Absolutely, using DatePart function. Similarly, let's say I want the month of this date, which is 8, which is nothing but August. Number 8. Can I get that back? Absolutely. Pass in the value for DatePart parameter as month. So if you look at this, we have the complete DatePart names and the abbreviations. I always prefer using the complete names instead of the abbreviations. So if you look at this DatePart, you pass in the weekday and then the date itself. It gives you the number of the weekday. In a week we have got 7 days, so Thursday is number 5. So it returns number 5. That's DatePart. So if you look at DatePart definition, it returns an integer. So DatePart returns an integer representing the specified date part. So here I am saying I want the weekday part of this date. That will be returned in the form of an integer. So that's 5. Thursday is 5. So 5 is returned back. Now, this DatePart function is very much similar to DateName. The only difference between DatePart and DateName is that DatePart returns an integer, whereas DateName returns an nvarchar. So, if you want the name of the weekday instead of the integer, then use DateName. And we have an example of that here. So if you look at this, it's the same example that we have seen on the slide. So when we execute this, from that date we get the date part, which returns 5, and date name, which returns Thursday. For example, let's say I want the month number, or I can just say month, and we execute that query. We get the month number, which is nothing but 8. On the other hand, if you want month name, you can just pass that to date name, which we have seen in the previous session, which is nothing but August. So DatePart and date name are pretty much similar. DateAdd, again, the name itself is self-explanatory. You want to add something to the date. Now again, when you look at the date, if you want to add something to this date, you have to tell, to which part of this date do you want to add something? Do you want to add it to the year, month, or day, or hours, minutes, seconds, milliseconds? So you specify that using DatePart, the first parameter. The first parameter is the DatePart parameter, and the second parameter is how many days or how many months or how many years do you want to add. So and the final one is the date itself. Alright, so here we are saying, to this date add 20 days. So to August 30 we will add 20 days, so which will be like September 19th, because in August I think there are 31 days. So September 19, 2012, and the time remains the same. It's possible that you can add negative values as well. So when you add negative values, what happens? It actually subtracts those. So to August 30th, here we are actually subtracting 20 days, so it's August 10th. Okay, so DateAdd basically returns the date time after adding specified number to add to the date part specified of the given date. And if you look at the examples, it's pretty much the same thing that we have seen on the slides. So when we execute this, we should get the same output as we have seen on the slides. And finally, DateDiff function. Again, DateDiff, the name itself is self-explanatory. It will give you the difference between the two dates. Okay, now if you look at this, again, this function also takes DatePart parameter. Okay, so you're saying, okay, I want the difference in months between these two dates. So if you look at the first date, it's November 30th 2005, and this is January 31st 2006, and you are saying, okay, I want the difference in months, which is nothing but there is roughly 2 months difference between these 2 days, okay, which is nothing but December in 2005 and January in 2006, so 2 months. In the second query, you are saying, okay, between the two same dates, I want the difference in days. Okay, so entire December 31 days and entire January 31 days, which is 62 days. So DateDiff. So these are pretty simple date time functions, okay, used for different purposes. The one common thing to keep in mind is about these date parts. Alright, so with that, let's look at a practical example of using these datetime functions. Now, if you look at the table on the right, I have the ID of the person, name, and date of birth. Now, in this table, I'm not storing the age of the person. Why? It doesn't make sense to store the age while you can compute the age using the date of birth of the person. So in reality, nobody stores the age of the person. It doesn't make sense because it keeps on changing. We only store the date of birth of a person, and whenever we need his age, we can calculate that by writing a query. Okay, so I have a table like this, and I want you to write a query which gives me all the columns including the age. I think I have misspelled the column name. Instead of saying date of birth, I should have said age. So age. So this Sam is 31 years old, John is 27 years, 0 months, 10 days old. So basically I need their age as well. So how to do that? So obviously we can use the functions that we have just discussed. So if you look at the functions that we have, I have already written this query so that we don't have to waste time in typing, and it's pretty simple to understand. So if you look at this query, it seems to be a little big, but the only complicated piece here is this case statement. So if you understand this, the logic behind having this case statement here, the rest of it is pretty simple. So obviously if we have to compute the age of the person, the simple formula that we have is from the current system date and time, subtract his date of birth. Okay, now how to get the current system date and time? We can use the getDate function. Okay, and so look at this. If you look at this code here, I have two variables. One is date of birth and the other one is temp date, both of type date time, and I have three variables, years, months, and days, to hold their years, months, and days. Obviously they are of type integer, and I am initializing the date of birth of the person to something, 8th October 1982. And what we are doing here, we are assigning that date of birth to another temporary variable, temp date, for processing. So these things are pretty simple. Declaration of variable, initializing to something, and then assigning that value to another variable. So the first thing that we have to do is to compute the number of years, how many years of difference is there between the date of birth and the current date. And to do that, we are using DateDiff function, and I'm saying, okay, I want the difference in years, and I'm passing the start date, which is nothing but the date of birth of the person, and the current date and time using getDate function. So once I subtract that, I get the difference in difference in years. Okay, but I want to also calculate the difference in months and days, which we'll do in a bit. Okay, but then if you look at this, after we get the difference in years, we are subtracting something from that. Okay, what is that and why do we need to understand that? So let's understand the logic for doing this. Why do we have to do it in the first place? Now to do that, I have written a simple query here to understand that. So if you look at this, the dates that I have here is November 30th 2005 and January 31st 2006. Now if I say I want the difference in years between these two dates, look at this, I'm using DateDiff. So when I execute this query, let's see what we get. It says there is a 1 year difference between these two dates. So if you look at these two dates, do we really have 1 year difference? No. Okay, it's just, this is November 30th, which means December of 2005, and January, literally 2 months. Okay, but because of the fact that it is 2005 and this is 2006, there is a difference of 1. DateDiff function incorrectly calculates that. Okay, that is the reason why we have to do this case. So we are saying, okay, if I get 1 in this case, it's not valid. Okay, there's actually 0 years and 2 months difference roughly. Okay, so that's why I'm saying, okay, if the month of date of birth, which is nothing but the start date, let's take this, if the month of the date of birth is greater than the month of get date, which means the current date and time, or okay, so if this condition is true, then what I want to do, I want to subtract from this years 1. Because why? These are already, there is no 1 year difference between my date of birth and the current system date and time. That's why we are subtracting here. Okay, and the same logic applies if the months are equal. Okay, so for some reason the months are equal, but then there could be difference in days. That's why we are saying, okay, if the day number of the date of birth is greater than the day number of the current system date and time, we still want to get that 1 and subtract from that year. Otherwise, don't subtract anything, 0. So it remains 1 year. And then next, what we need to do, we need to add that year to the date. These years, whatever we get, that we need to add to the year, to the date of birth. Otherwise, what will happen? Look at this. If I say, okay, I don't want the year difference, let's say I want the difference in days, for example. Okay, so if I execute this, it gives me 62 days. Why? Because it takes the, if you look at 30 and 31, it's only 1 day, but it takes the month also into consideration. That's why it will give us 62, 31 days in the month of December of 2005 and 31 days in January 2006. The same is applicable to years as well. That's why to the actual date of birth, since you have calculated the number of years, you don't want that to be carried forward into calculating months. What we do, we add those years to the temporary date of birth, and then we compute the months. So we only get the months now. Okay, so once we get those months, and it's the same logic here again. Okay, DateDiff, I want months from that temp date and the current date. Okay, the difference between these two in terms of months. Okay, and this logic is the same. The reason why we did this case statement here is the same here as well. Okay, and finally and next we'll actually add the months to the temp date, and finally we calculate the difference in days between the date of birth and the current time. And what we are doing here, okay, since we have calculated months, days and years on the top, we finally select years as years, months as months, and days as days. Okay, so if we execute this query, let's comment out this line here. So if I execute this query, you should see for a person born on 8th October 1982, his age is 29 years, 10 months, and 24 days. Okay, now, okay, we have done this, but what is our ultimate aim? Our ultimate aim is basically to achieve an output like this. Now, to achieve an output like this, we have to convert this into a function. We haven't spoken about writing user-defined functions yet, which we'll be doing in a later session, but for completion's sake, let me try to convert this into a function. Okay, here we are hard coding the value. We don't want to be hard coding the value. We want to be passing this as a parameter to a function. Okay, so we have seen how to create stored procedures. To create stored procedures, we use create procedures, and then the stored procedure name. Similarly, to create a function, we will say create function and the function name. So create function, and then the function name, let's call fn, let's say compute age. Okay, so obviously if you want to compute age of a person, to that function you will have to pass a parameter. So let's say I want to pass date of birth. Let's say date time is the parameter, and this function is going to return an nvar of maybe what do you say, 50 as begin, and what we want to do is end this. Okay, so what we are saying, okay, this function is going to take date of birth as the input parameter and return his age in the form of nvar. Okay, since we are passing in the parameter, we don't have to have this hard-coded value here, so we can get rid of that. Okay, so that's the first change. And the final change that we have to do is, instead of selecting these as 3 different columns, let's assign them to a variable of type nvar and return back from the function. Okay, to do that, first we need to declare a variable of type nvar. So let's call this at age of type nvar of, let's say, 50. And we are saying to this variable, okay, if you look at the output, what we want the years, and then 31 years, 8 months, 2 days old, which means we have this years, months, and days. We need to concatenate to those numbers, these strings, years, months, and days old. Okay, and to do that, we will basically say set at age is equal to, we want to assign to that age at years plus, and we will say, because this variable contains the total number of years, and plus, what else we want the months as well. So copy the months variable, and then to that say that many months, and finally append that to days and say days old. That's it. So we can get rid of the select statement finally, and then we will return the age of the person. So if you look at this age variable, it's of type nvar of 50, and if you look at our function, this function returns an nvar of 50. That's it. Okay, but there is a small thing that we have to do. If you look at this years data type is an integer. Similarly, months and days as well. So, but we are concatenating an integer variable to nvar string. So in order to do that, you will have to convert that to nvar, and to convert one data type to another data type, we can use the cast function. Cast years as nvar of maybe 4. Okay, let's copy that. We have to do the same thing for months and days. So cast months as nvar, months are usually 2, so let's put that. Similarly, we have to do it for days. So cast days as nvar of 2. That's it. We have our function now. So let's create this function. So command completed successfully, which means this function has got created. Okay, now to execute that function, just like any other system function, you will say select fn compute age, and to this function you will have to pass a date of birth. So let's pass in this date of birth, and when you execute this you will get an error. Okay, so for this user defined function you will have to prefix dbo because it's present in that dbo schema. We'll talk about functions in detail in a later session, don't worry. So when we press that, I get 6 years, 9 months, 2 days old. Look at this, I got this as a one column now. Now what I can do now is basically use this function within a select statement. So when I say select star from TBL employee table, we get all those columns. It's actually employees column, which has got the date of birth. Okay, so what we want now, along with the date of birth, we need the age of the person. Okay, so if we want the age of the person, we can use this function. Okay, so from this we want the ID of the person, name of the person as usual, date of birth as usual, but then we want the age of the person. So we use this function which is capable of calculating the age, and we will give it an alias name as age from TBL employees. So let's execute this and see what's going to happen. Okay, so age column. But if you look at this, for everybody it is saying 6 years, 9 months, 2 days old. And you should have guessed why. That's because we have passed this date, hard-coded date here. Instead of that, we want to be passing the column name itself. So for each row, this function calculates their age and prints that here. So when we execute this, we should get their ages. So now this matches what we want, the age of the person. Now here, this logic, don't worry about this logic. If it is too complicated for you at this time, I will go ahead and paste this in my blog. Check my blog, it should be there in case if you want to digest that later. I hope you have enjoyed this session. On this slide you can find resources for ASP.NET and C# interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.